We're kind of right in the middle of a discussion that Paul is having in Philippians chapter 3. He's talking about his resume, and I wanted to look at that in a little bit more depth because we have a responsibility to see that one of the underlying principles of the gospel is that we are wrong, and that the best that we can do is earn ourselves death. And so when we have in our minds the deception of sort of being inflated with the good maybe that we can do or have done, that's when we no longer see our need for God. So in the discussion that Paul is having, of course, I talked about Wednesday night how God in his genius picked Paul because Paul had the greatest resume among the Jews. He was the Jewish Jew, and I think I said he was the Jewish Jew, which was important because the opponent of the church was the Jews, and he was to bring the Gentiles in, but it was the Jews who had this inflated self-perception that were keeping the Gentiles at arm's length, so to speak, and not seeing them as one part of the body. You know, if you go back to Ephesians chapter 3, where he talks about tearing down the wall of separation between the Jews and the Gentiles, and that's the mystery of the gospel. This was the mind-blowing idea that for hundreds of years you had the people of God who were this hand-selected group, and now, well, it's for everyone. And in fact, some of the people who are in that hand-selected group are now disqualifying themselves because they have in their minds that it was God that needed them, rather than understanding it's them that needs God. And so as they go through and resist Christianity, they're resisting because of this backdrop that they have in their lives that they can trace all the way back to Abraham, where they can say, well, look at who I am. You're telling me that doesn't mean anything anymore. And essentially, what's interesting about it is you could say that Paul is telling them, well, that never really did mean anything, because if that's the way that you thought that you were special before God, then you've missed it altogether. And I want you to think about this, though. If you were to just compare Acts chapter 2 and Acts chapter 7, what do you have in those two chapters? Who can tell me? In Acts chapter 2 and Acts chapter 7, you have two things. What do you have? You have the gospel. You have two sermons, right? And both of them are to Jews. Now, one of the things this tells us is that you can't pigeonhole all of the Jews. In the same way, you can't pigeonhole every person in a community or every person in a culture. Not everybody thinks the same. We are individuals, and we think, and we have, what I mean is we think for ourselves. Some people let others do the thinking for them. They get caught up in a particular culture or a movement or a way of thinking, a way that validates them, and they get kind of sucked into that, and they don't question it at all. And so you have some who are willing to be wrong because they're not concerned about winning an argument. They're concerned about eternity. And so you have the two receptions. Now, the reason I say that is because when we think about the Jews, the first Christians were Jews. It's not as if all of the Jews were an opponent to the church at first, because you have some, like Paul, who it's hard to say what he knew exactly and how much he rejected. We only have him consenting to the death of Stephen, and we hear that sermon that he stands and he hears and he doesn't receive it. Some people require a little bit more of a shock to their system, you might say, that Paul needed to be able to go through that process of cognitive dissonance. The idea that the things that I thought were true in my life, they're not true anymore. For some people, that's just too terrifying to think about, and so they don't ask questions about what they believe. And when you stop asking questions about what you believe, because you're afraid that what you believe may not be true, that's when you'll kind of just go along with whoever, right? Well, it becomes even easier not to question who you are when all of your life and for hundreds of years you have been God's selected people. And so Paul is selected by God to show that all of that stuff, all of the accolades, credentials, everything about it is worth giving up. And that translates to us in a very beautiful way that we'll get to at the end of this. But so we'll start in verse 1 here, but we're really going to look at verses 5, 6, and 7. So he says, "Finally, my brothers, rejoice in the Lord. To write the same things to you is no trouble to me and is safe for you. Look out for the dogs, look out for the evildoers, look out for those who mutilate the flesh." And of course, that's the Jews or the Judaizing teachers. You could say that that's Christians who were Jews who were saying they needed to follow the law, but it could also just be the opponents of Christianity who were Jews, right? So then he says, "For we are the circumcision." We've discussed this in detail. We are the ones who have had the heart circumcised. He says, who worship by the Spirit of God and glory in Christ Jesus, put no confidence in the flesh. And so he says it is God who has circumcised our hearts in the sense that he has removed the curse or the results, the payment that the flesh gives us. When we give into the flesh, we deserve death. So he has removed what the sin of the flesh has caused. He's removed all of the ramifications of what the flesh does to your life in earning you death and earning you that curse. And so he says we have now the sign of the covenant in baptism. Done a long discussion of that in Colossians chapter 2. And so he says, and we worship God or we glorify God and not ourselves. We don't see ourselves as great. We see God as great. And we don't put confidence in what we have done or what we can do. We put our confidence in God. And actually, if you see, the Father, the Son, and the Spirit are all used in this statement here, that we worship by the Spirit of God and glory in Christ Jesus and put no confidence in the flesh. So then he says, though I myself have reason for confidence in the flesh, also, if anyone else thinks he has reason for confidence in the flesh, I have more. This is where you get into, why did God pick him? Because there was no one who excelled him. You might have found someone that was equal to him, but there wasn't anyone that excelled him in Judaism. But this isn't just about Judaism. This is about anyone who would come to God and say, look how great I am. Or anyone who would even become a Christian. And then they would begin to have sort of and this, you might say, well, I don't really see this much, but this idea that becoming a Christian means then that you're special in some way. You begin to have pride about that. As you begin to have, you may say, bear fruits worthy of repentance, where you begin to actually live the transformed life, it then can be easy to look at what God has done in transforming your life and look back on that and kind of have the attitude that the Jews had. Well, look how good I am now. That can be very easy to do. And in that way, we can get caught up in our own arrogance and we could think, well, it's really it's God that needs me in the church. It's not really that I need God. I mean, God's already done his work with me. He needs me. Whenever we start to think, well, it's God that really needs me, and when you begin to flirt with that line, then you begin to see why this whole argument that Paul is making becomes relevant to us. Because when we begin to look at our own lives and think good things about ourselves, then we begin to be tempted to sort of let our goodness be inflated in comparison to God's goodness. And that way we have confidence in the flesh and glory in ourselves rather than confidence in God and glory in God or glorifying God. And so, all right, so let's see here. Gone through this here. All right. So verses 5 and 6, I want to sort of dissect these, but not too much, because I want us to see exactly what all this means. So he says, circumcised on the 8th day, of the people of Israel, of the tribe of Benjamin, a Hebrew of Hebrews, as to law, a Pharisee, as to zeal, a persecutor of the church, as to righteousness under the law, blameless. Now, if you could or would think, even just in your minds, to make a list of all of the things that you think the best of the best Christian should be doing. Maybe you think of someone who does things and you think, you know what, I want to grow and to be able to do that thing, right? Or to be able to have that confidence, or to be able to have a good grasp of that concept. And you think to that person, you think all of the things that the ideal Christian is doing and should be doing. And you were to just make a list of that. That's essentially what Paul is doing here in the context of Judaism. Because it's important for us to be able to make the own list for ourselves of all of the things that we think are great about ourselves. And then to be able to follow Paul's train of thought and do that with ourselves. Because if we miss that, then we don't understand the importance of this and how it relates to us. Because he was addressing a particular thing in the first century that had to do with the Jews in the church, but this principle is something that affects all of us in a very deep way. So let's look at these. First, circumcised on the 8th day. Well, what's so special about that? Well, first of all, what's circumcision? When you go back to the study that we did previously about how Paul says, well, we are the circumcision. What is that today? If it's the sign of the covenant, and today the sign of the covenant is baptism, then you have this statement where he's saying, look, I bear the sign of the covenant, but not only that, but I have it from birth. In other words, I didn't sometime along the line enter into Judaism because I stumbled upon it and thought it was good and chose to convert to it. Because you could do that. You could enter into it at a later time in life. And so he's saying, no, I started in exactly the way the law told me to start. And of course, if you remember, his father was a Roman because he's a Roman citizen, but his mother and I was talking with Cary about this Wednesday night, his mother and his grandmother were Jews. And his lineage through his mother and his grandmother were, even though they were women, when you think of in ancient terms, in Judaism, it gave him full status. He was not comparable to a Samaritan or something like that, even though his father was a Roman. Because mother and grandmother were Jewish, then he was a Jew. And so you can then compare that to how Jesus himself traces his lineage all the way through women as well. And that didn't change it at all. That didn't diminish it or anything. We gave full credit. But he was not a convert, or as they would call it, a proselyte. Someone who would be evangelized to and brought into it. So he started it exactly the way he needed to start it as far as being a Jew. Then he says that he's of the people of Israel. Now, this is kind of interesting because when you think of him saying that he is of the people of Israel, who was Israel? Because when you connect this and then you begin to use Israel the way that it's used in most of Scripture, then it gives a lot of meaning to it. So who was Israel? I'll give you a hint. It was one person. A guy named Israel. You remember who he was? What's that? Sort of. One more generation? This is Jacob. Jacob was named Israel. Okay, so you could claim to be a child of Abraham. Do you know what religious group claims to be a child of Abraham? That's not Christian, not Jewish. Muslims. And you know how? Not through Israel, but not through Jacob, not through Isaac, but through Ishmael, right? And of course that you have the friction there between the two right there, children of Abraham, right? Which is why that they want the sacred mountain of Mount Moriah, which is, as far as we can tell, Mount Moriah, where he went to sacrifice Isaac, where Abraham sacrificed Isaac, is where the Temple Mount is today. That's, as far as we can tell, and so that's why they want that plot of land right there, is because that's significant historically. They claim their lineage back to Abraham. Now, I mean, I remember sitting at a lecture of a man who was Muslim who converted to Christianity, and he talked all about, in detail about this claim of the Muslim religion. They go all the way back to Abraham. Okay, so Paul says through Israel, so that means not through Ishmael. And also it doesn't mean through Esau, because the promise was fulfilled to Abraham through whom? Through Isaac. And Isaac had two sons, Jacob and Esau. Now the promise was then fulfilled through whom? Through Jacob, who then, when he wrestled with God, was named Israel. So when you think of the phrase children of Israel or nation of Israel, what you're really describing are quite literally the 12 tribes of Israel, which are the 12 sons of Jacob. And so when he says that I'm of the tribe, I'm of the people of Israel, then he's saying, well, I'm not from Esau, which were the Edomites, because they could trace their lineage back to Abraham. And I'm not of those who claim through Ishmael. He says, I am one who claims through Jacob. And so he narrows this down, and you find this to be even a pertinent thing with the prophecy that's made and then carried through Abraham, Isaac, and then Jacob. So whenever you hear someone say the children of Israel, that quite literally means the descendants of Jacob. And so in Galatians 6, which I have here, at least I thought I did. Yeah, in Galatians 6 here, they're at the very end, verse 16. As for all who walk by this rule, peace and mercy be upon them and upon the Israel of God. Who is the Israel of God? Well, you see, symbolically, when you look at the New Testament and he talks about the 12 tribes and that sort of stuff, he's talking about, in general terms, the people of God. Those who are the descendants and the recipients of the promises, the one through whom the Messiah came, the one through that the Messiah belongs to, right? And so the Israel of God is who? Who is that? If you look further up in this passage here on the screen, it says, neither circumcision nor uncircumcision means anything, but what means something? A new creation. So someone that has gone through the new birth. Someone who bears the sign of the covenant of the new birth, which is baptism, right? Which is spiritual circumcision, which is what makes someone the true Israel of God, which are Christians. And so Christians are now the Israel of God. So what Paul says, but yeah, I'm the Israel of God, but I also literally trace back to Israel, the physical people of God, before it was metaphorical for spiritual and for eternal. It was actually for the people then, the physical people. And you can see then how if that was you might look down on someone who is just a descendant of Esau. Oh, well, you were just cousins of Jacob. Oh, Ishmael? Oh, y'all are just outcasts altogether. Y'all are just a bunch of barbarians. You can see how they might say that sort of thing or think inflated about themselves. Then he says, of the tribe of Benjamin. Now, who can tell me what's special about the tribe of Benjamin? And maybe you have a different answer than me. Okay, all right. He was the cherished youngest son and the full brother of Joseph. And if you notice, Joseph was so special that there actually isn't a tribe of Joseph. There's no tribe of Joseph. There's actually Ephraim and Manasseh, his two sons. The tribe of Ephraim, the tribe of Manasseh. And there's actually 13 tribes. The tribe of Levi didn't really have any geographic land. And so there are actually 13 designations of land, right, throughout the land of Canaan. And that's sort of an interesting thing that Joseph's descendants are given a double portion, even though he is one of the youngest, right? Benjamin being the youngest. Well, when the divided kingdom then became a singular kingdom, well, let's say the kingdom divided, and it's easier to say who wasn't in the north rather than who was in the north, right? Who were of the southern kingdom? Who was left as the people who were continuing to follow God faithfully and actually had some good kings, as opposed to the northern kingdom that didn't have any good kings? Who were designated to be in the southern kingdom? What is the southern kingdom called? If the northern kingdom is called what? Israel, the southern kingdom is called what? Judah. Now, Judah is what? Judah is one of the tribes, right? But Judah is not the only tribe in the southern kingdom, even though that's what it was called. What was the other tribe? It was part of Benjamin was still there, right? And so now I want you to think about it for a second here. Paul is from the tribe of Benjamin. Who else is a descendant of the southern kingdom? Jesus. I want you to think about this, okay? Paul, now you think about the idea that you take Judah and you take Benjamin and you separate them from the other 11 tribes, okay? Because look, some of the Levites stayed in the north, but some of them evacuated the north and came south because they wanted to be faithful. So there were 13 tribes in that sense. Joseph divided into two. But if you were to go back and think about the significance of being a part of one of the two tribes that remain faithful, but not only remain faithful, but what? The northern kingdom, those 11 tribes, they went into Assyrian captivity, and then what happened to them? They were gone. And they kind of trickled back in little by little. And they intermarried with other nations, and they kind of migrated back into the northern geographic area of Canaan. And then what were they called? They were called the Samaritans. Okay, but you have the tribe of Judah and the tribe of Benjamin that went to Babylonian captivity for 70 years, and they came back. God blessed them to come back, and they rebuilt Jerusalem and the walls and the temple, reinstituted the old law. And so to say that you are a descendant of either Judah or Benjamin in the scheme of the nation of Israel is sort of like claiming, I'm a direct descendant of a signer of the Declaration of Independence, or my grandparents or great grandparents were some of the pilgrims on the Mayflower, or something like that. Like these were a special group in antiquity in the world of the Jews. And so Paul is saying, you know what? I'm not from Ishmael. I'm not from Esau. I'm a direct descendant through Israel, Jacob, Isaac to Abraham. And of all of the tribes of Israel, I'm not a descendant of one of the tribes that went into sin, that abandoned the law and the worship that they were supposed to do and started doing their own things and became unfaithful and went into captivity and never returned. I'm of the special two tribes who remain faithful. And so it's important for us when he's saying these things, when he says, I'm circumcised on the 8th day, and I'm of the people of Israel, and I'm of the tribe of Benjamin, that this holds a significance for the Jewish reader, that this would have an extra special meaning for them. We need to see a little bit of the depth of that. But I read something somewhere that I thought was telling, and I don't know that I disagree with it, but I'll ask you the question to see if you can give the same conclusion that this particular author gave. Of all of the people of the tribe of Benjamin, well, let me ask you this. What really, really famous character was of the tribe of Benjamin? Saul, King Saul, okay? So it was a royal tribe, but then the royal tribe became what under David? Judah. Isn't that interesting? So yeah, Benjamin and Judah continue to be the royal tribes. Okay, but the question is, who is the greatest person ever to come out of the tribe of Benjamin? Now, I just read this somewhere, and I can't disagree with it. It was Paul. You think about that. I mean, when he says, look, I'm of the tribe of Benjamin, and they were to look at him, and by Jewish standards even, he was the greatest of all. But then in the idea of him extending himself, abandoning all of that the Jews held so dear, and then allowing God to transform him into something, he was the greatest of the tribe of Benjamin that God was ever able to elevate someone, because he had a total humility and emptying of himself, which is what this is all about. Yes, sir. Yeah, that was the problem, is that they were just looking down their noses at people. And so he's going to get to all these reasons that people were arrogant and looking down their nose at others. He's going to tell them what that's really worth as we continue. And that's the whole point of this. Okay, all right, let's see here. Then he says he's a Hebrew of Hebrews. Now, there were millions of Hebrews, and they were scattered about antiquity. And one of the special things about the people who were Jews were that they, wherever they went, they prided themselves on continuing to keep their religion and their feasts and those sorts of things. But what happened for a lot of them is they would move into a place, and they would adopt the language there, and they wouldn't speak Hebrew anymore. And so Paul says, not only am I all of these things, but I'm someone who was raised by a Roman father, and I was born in Asia Minor, Tarsus of Cilicia, but was sent to sit at the feet of Gamaliel and to uphold the Jewish religion in the original language. So he was an upholder of the purity of it as well. He makes that statement in Acts 22 about how he was sat at the feet of Gamaliel. But who remembers where Gamaliel actually gives a little speech? Do you remember? I personally think Gamaliel, I give him an 85% chance that he became a Christian. Acts chapter 5, that's right. And what does he say? He says, look, if this is from God, we can't stand against it. If it's not from God, it's going to collapse on its own. And that's very, very wise words. That's the type of words that allows you to be wrong. It allows you to look at your own presuppositions and say, is there evidence to warrant this? And Gamaliel was weighing the evidence. He was not just assuming things. All right, so then Paul, excuse me, then he begins to show that really he's at the top of every category within Judaism. So he says, as to the law, I was a Pharisee, or am a Pharisee. I don't know if he still were to claim that, but there were only several thousand Pharisees ever. Some claim that there was around no more than 6,000 of them. And it was a very small group. I think it was probably the smallest of the sects of the Jews. And I think the Sadducees were the largest and actually had the most political power. And you think about it today, that they were almost atheists. They didn't believe in the resurrection or the spirit, that sort of thing. It was really kind of a fascinating thing. It's sort of like today, and I'll let you think about what that means. But the Pharisees, the term Pharisee literally meant separated ones, almost like the term holy or sanctified. They were the ones that dedicated themselves to this very strict observance of the law. The problem with it is that they looked at their strict observance and they had a lot of pride about that. And in fact, but then what they would do is they would miss the spirit of the law, keeping the letter of the law, and then they would elevate the traditions that they had made around the law and say, look at how great we're following these traditions of the law, and neglecting the weightier matters of mercy and justice when it came to upholding the actual law. And so that's where they began to miss the mark. But they had that reputation for being very, very precise in the way they upheld Judaism. Then he says, as to zeal, persecuting the church. Now you can do a long study in how zeal plays a part in Judaism. And that was a claim of righteousness, that you were not just a passive observer of those who stood in opposition as a threat to Judaism, but you were one who was willing to go and to fight. And so he says that he didn't have just passive convictions about it. He actually went and persecuted the church. And of course, we know that he persecuted the church with a good conscience. He genuinely thought that the church was the enemy of God's people. Now, interestingly, in thinking that, he fought to destroy the church, and he makes that statement in a few places. He makes that statement in 1 Corinthians 15. I believe he makes it in 1 Timothy. You see, I think 1 Timothy chapter 1 or 2 Timothy chapter 1. And he's not ashamed to speak of his own shame in that way. In fact, I have a quote here from Barclay. It says, Paul was never ashamed to confess his shame and to tell men that once he had hated the Christ whom now he loved, and once he sought to obliterate the church which now he served. But you think about the idea that there were those who were false Christs even in the first century. There were always people who were threatening the religious order of Israel. And that in all of those other situations and circumstances, Paul standing and fighting against those who opposed Judaism, he would have, in a sense, been in the right. Because look, if someone says something like, I and the Father are one, if I were to say that to you, what would be the proper response to me? I and the Father are one. You would say, well, that's blasphemy, right? You're a heretic. You're not the Son of God, right? That would be appropriate to tell me, right? Well, those are the very things that Jesus said. And had they not been true, the people that opposed Jesus would have actually been right. The problem was that they didn't see that he was actually who he said he was. They were just treating him like every phony that had ever come. And Paul, if he were fighting against one of the phonies, he actually would have been staying true to God. And he says, I was zealous in that way in fighting against what I thought was a true opponent of God's people, but then later was confronted and realized that it was God's people. And then he says, as to righteousness under the law, I was blameless. As far as the law went, There was anyone that could criticize him, he was above reproach. And so he says, I know we got, let's see here. All right, I got 3 minutes. So then verse 7, he says, but whatever gain I had, I counted as loss for the sake of Christ. I take all this and I just flush it down the toilet. None of that means anything, because when I come to the table where God is standing there, and I come to the table, I can't say, look at how great I am. I have to say, look at how I've ruined things. That's all that Paul could say. None of that would credit him anything with God. And so all the things that he accomplished in life when he met Christ, it had to go from the category of credit to the category of debt. All these things that he could have gloried in himself, he pushed them aside so that Christ could receive the glory. So when we ourselves come to God, we have to just push aside all the things that we think we have accomplished in that list of all the things that good Christians do, and we have to say, no, you know what? The best I've earned is debt. And all glory goes to you, God. The only good that I've done is because you've worked through me. Is because I've allowed you to do some things in me. And I haven't done it myself. It is you who gets the glory and the credit. I have only earned debt. And so when we think about, and this is what I was thinking of. 1 Corinthians 15, Paul mentions this. Starting in verse 8, he says, last of all, as to one untimely born, he appeared also to me. This is the resurrected Christ. He says, for I am the least of the apostles, unworthy to be called an apostle, because I persecuted the church of God. But by the grace of God, I am what I am, and his grace toward me was not in vain. On the contrary, I worked harder than any of them, though it was not I, but the grace of God that is with me. And so I did all these great things, but the glory is to God. The best I can do is earn death. And so even though I have done all these great things that you might put on the list of great things that a Christian does, I never bring those to God and say, look how much you need me. He comes to God and he says, look at all that you've been able to accomplish. And so I want to finish with what he talks about in Galatians 3. This will only take just a couple of minutes. Galatians 1. I don't know why I said 3. Galatians chapter 1. This is when he's discussing how he received the gospel and what happened right after that, because he was, in the eyes of the church, he was a terrorist. And so here's what he says. You have heard of my former life in Judaism, how I persecuted the church of God violently and tried to destroy it. And I was advancing in Judaism beyond many of my own age among my people. So extremely zealous was I for the traditions of my fathers. But when he who had set me apart before I was born and who called me by his grace was pleased to reveal his son to me in order that I might preach him among the Gentiles, I did not immediately consult with anyone, nor did I go up to Jerusalem to those who were apostles before me, but I went away into Arabia and returned to Damascus. He's saying, I received the gospel from God, not from man. Then he says this, verse 18, then after 3 years I went up to Jerusalem to visit Cephas and remained with him 15 days, but I saw none of the other apostles except James, the Lord's brother. In what I'm writing to you before God, I do not lie. Then I went into the regions of Syria and Cilicia, and I was still unknown in person to the churches of Judea that are in Christ. They only were hearing it said, quote, he who used to persecute us is now preaching the faith he once tried to destroy, and they glorified God because of me. You see, the whole point that Paul ever tries to make of what God had done in bringing him out of this prestigious place of Judaism and his assault against the church and his transformation and all these great things. In 1 Corinthians 15, he says, but it was the grace of God that did this. And here he says, when they heard that this terrorist was disrupting and destroying the church and killing Christians, he says, when this word got spread around, God was glorified in it. And that was his only goal. He knew that no other motive, there wasn't anything else that he could do with what he accomplished in his life that would do any good for him other than saying, all of this is to God's glory. The only thing that I have earned is debt. It is God who elevates. And so anytime we think that God needs us, we need to realize that all we bring to the table is debt. And that it is God who credits us with the blood of Christ. And so every good, every transformed thing, every holy and pure and sanctified thing, all of the growth that we have, we can't ever say, look at how great I am and look at how much God needs me for the church. We always have to look at it and say, look at how great God is and look at what He's done. Glory to God. And that's the brilliance of Paul being selected to be the one who could say these things, because there wasn't anyone that could stand toe-to-toe with him. Any other comments or anything about this? Questions or anything? Appreciate your patience. We'll be dismissed for just a little while. Thank you for being here this morning.